like to do here today is give you a selection of some of the research that we've been doing on typically developing children, especially in the area of developing phonology, but also the interface between phonological development and grammatical morphology as well. My goal here really is to share with you some of the types of findings that we've come across in looking at typical language development where children show a lot of variability in their actual speech production forms. And one of the questions is, well, why is this the case? And basically it comes down to sort of immature developing phonologies. And this may well have implications for better understanding of what's going on with children with hearing loss as well. So one of the issues that comes out from a lot of our research is that there's real phonological context effects. So it's not as though a child always produces a certain form at a certain time. Am I not mic'd?
Keep going.
Yeah? Okay. But that there's some variability in what the child actually produces. So how do we evaluate if a child produces something, say, 50% of the time? What's our take-home message from that? Do they have the representation? Do they have a voicing contrast? Do they have what's necessary for putting speech together and putting language together? What do we do with those types of results? So a lot of our research has been looking recently at some of the acoustic aspects of children's early speech. And here again, the literature mostly is focused on onset consonants. Lately we've been looking at coda consonants, the ends of words. And here we've been looking at some of the acoustic cues to feature contrast there, both for place and voicing contrast. And especially we've been looking at temporal types of processing. There's been a lot of work done on spectral types of information in these, but not as much on some of the temporal processes in children's early speech. What comes out of some of this research is that, again, we find real differences in onset consonants and coda consonants, as you might expect, but children are treating them differently as well. And some of this comes out from some of our recent research actually using ultrasound methods, where we can see what's going on with the articulators in producing consonants at the beginnings of words compared to consonants at the ends of words. The other issue that comes up here is that there's a real difference in where in an utterance, where in a sentence, children might be producing certain words with certain types of sounds. So we find again and again that sounds that are produced at the ends of utterances or ends of sentences tend to be better produced than those that occur utterance medially. And there's various reasons for this, and what I'd like to do here is step you through some of what seems to be going on in this case. So phonological context seems to be important for understanding children's language development. When we look at basic research, we don't find much information about this. This is true also in looking at reports of normative development. When you look at reports of segmental development in typically developing populations, oftentimes it's not broken down into whether a sound begins at the beginning or the end of a word. And in clinical assessment tools, oftentimes these issues aren't fully transparent either. So we get reports of, say, present consonants correct, but we don't know if those consonants occur at the beginnings or ends of words or in the middle. Maybe children are having problems with clusters, but we don't know, are those onset clusters? Are they coda, end of word clusters? Are they, what kinds of segments are there? If they occur at the end of the word, are they complex morphological units that are causing the problem, or are they just the segments that actually occur? So when we look at language development in children with hearing impairment, some of these same issues may arise. So despite overall good vocabulary scores, children seem to exhibit problems with language, especially higher aspects of language. And in this case, there are many reports of problems with grammatical morphology. Some of this is separate grammatical function items. Other of it is inflectional types of morphology. So one of the questions is why? What seems to be going on in these cases? Well, one of the issues that arises from this is, are grammatical morphemes, when there are problems, is it a perceptual problem or a production problem? So given that a child produces something, how can we tell if it's really that they're not hearing something and producing it, or if it's really something that's going on at a higher level of language processing, and that's why these things are being left out. So to the extent that we see that these are problems for typically developing children as well, with normal hearing, this suggests that maybe it's not just a perceptual problem, that there's higher level aspects of grammatical processing, sentence processing, that are also involved in contributing to some of this variability. And these, especially the area of grammatical morphemes, has been a real issue for children with language delay or specific language impairment. This has been long known, so there's been a fair amount of research in this area, but still we don't fully understand why this is a problem and what might be contributing to it. So there's possibly other explanations. There could be perceptual problems, but we know that children with hearing loss also have problems with working memory. Children with language delay do as well. And certainly as sentences get longer, even typically normal hearing children also have problems with working memory. And we begin to see things fall apart as working memory is taxed. There's also, we know that frequency of a certain type of structure, be it a certain type of syllable structure or a certain type of word structure, also plays a big role in how competent children are at being able to produce those forms. So just as an example, what happens in English with a word like banana? A 2-year-old often truncates it down to nana. Sometimes bana, but nana. Oftentimes this, 2-syllable, strong, weak type of form. There's no morphology there at all. They have normal hearing, and yet, given the dominant structure of English, which tends to start with stressed syllables, we get these weak initial syllables dropped out until around 2.5 for typically developing children. Other people have been looking at phonological probabilities and neighborhood density. We know that this also has a big effect on the shape that children's early words take. But if we looked at a somewhat higher level, oftentimes people have thought that when it comes to grammatical morphemes, one of the reasons children are leaving these forms out is really a syntactic or a semantic problem. Maybe they don't really understand how the grammar fits together and what all the pieces are that bring all that together. Some of our work, however, suggests that actually, given a child who is producing a form, say, 50% of the time, all in completely grammatical contexts, they must have some representation, some idea of the syntax and also of the meaning of these forms to be able to use them appropriately in those contexts. So what's going on with the other 50%? And how do we understand whether, what the mental representation of these entities in language actually is? So we've been looking a lot at the level of phonology and phonological context effects to try and tease these issues apart and better understand why we get these gradual types of learning curves. We don't get learning curves that are nothing and then all. Rather, we get very, very gradual learning curves similar to the types of learning curves that you've seen in a lot of the data that you work with. So it's really phonological processing or prosodic context that seems to be playing a role here, and probably issues of both speech processing and speech planning. So one of the early demonstrations of this comes from a nice study by Luann Gherkin, where she had an elicited imitation task with children about 2 years, 3 months. And what she noticed is that when you have a sentence like, he kicks the piggy, and in this case here, the follows the monosyllabic word kicks. You get stress on kicks. And then the article is a weak syllable, so you get a strong, weak type of rhythmic unit that we can call a foot. Okay, this is a strong, weak prosodic unit. And children are, this age, are pretty good at producing this article, about 75% of the time. Okay. However, if you take exactly the same context, so an article that occurs before the noun in the sentence, it's the same article, it has the same meaning, okay? In he catches the piggy. The only difference is the prosodic context, i.e., in this case, the follows a disyllabic verb, catches. So this is already a strong, weak unit. Now, the is out here on its own. It can't glob onto the previous word. So what happens in this case? It tends to get omitted. Okay? So here we've kept constant the syntax and the semantics, the meaning and the structure. The only difference here is what context, phonological context, this article actually appears in. And here, children were below chance. Okay? So there's quite a difference then in these contexts where only phonological position is involved. Well, this type of result was an experiment. We wanted to know if this would happen in spontaneous speech. Maybe there was something about the experimental context that led to this result, but what happened in spontaneous speech? So we wanted to look for some data that we could analyze to address this issue. There was nothing in the public domain. At the time, there was no data with spontaneous speech data, even in a language like English, where most acquisition work has been done, for children between the ages of 1 and 2, at the beginnings of use of these morphemes. So we were, with generous funding from NIH, we were able to go out and collect and annotate a corpus of data to be able to address these questions. So this resulted in the Providence corpus. And this was, we mic'd both child and mother. Here you can see a little microphone on the child here. And so we have very good, or reasonably good, obviously these were in people's living rooms, so not completely good acoustic recordings, but really quite good enough that we can do acoustic analysis of these forms. So there's quite a bit of data here. It's all on the childless database, if anyone wants to look at it. And this provided us with ample data of a number of mother-child pairs where we could actually look at children's spontaneous speech. So for looking at article use, we looked at these 5 children. You can see their ages here, going from quite young for some of the precocious ones, up until about 2.5 years old, with a mean length of utterance going up to around 3 words, and quite a bit of data there. So here the blue is the easy cases, the number of tokens in the easy cases. The pink is the harder, the unfooted types of cases, okay. And we coded the data and had reliability. So critically here, we're looking at data where in the footed case, we predict that it would be easier to produce in a form like it's a bag compared to a star, or the same in longer utterances. So this is a type of learning curve one typically gets. So most people, if they look at a spontaneous speech sample, you'll plot whatever you're looking for over time. And you would say, looking at this child, they don't really understand about how to use these articles until, fairly late here. This is a precocious child, so she's actually fairly early, but you can see that there's a developmental trajectory here. What we did then was pull this data apart into the easy cases, the ones that combine to form a strong, weak prosodic unit, and plotted those against those that Gherkin found were more often left out. Okay? So what I'm going to do here now is pull these apart and show you what happens by child, for each child. Okay? So we pull these apart here. You can see the blue line are the easy ones. These are the ones that form this prosodic unit. Actually, she's doing quite well from the first stages when she begins to use these forms. But the harder ones, the words that don't form this prosodic unit, are really omitted almost all the time. Okay? And we see the same pattern with child after child. So here's the next child, similar type of pattern. Next child, similar type of pattern, and so forth. Okay. So this seems to be a very, very robust effect. This is spontaneous speech, okay, which is messier than we might expect in an experiment, and yet we see exactly the same types of results that Gherkin found in her experiment. So what's interesting here is that there seem to be phonological context effects. It's not as though when a child is producing a form, even maybe only 20% of the time, it may be that they actually have fairly good representations of this form, but there are other factors that are minimizing their ability to produce these. So this raises then questions about children with hearing impairment. Will we see similar types of patterns? We've replicated these results across a number of different languages, and both normal hearing and SLI children. So what about children with hearing impairment? This also raises the issue of what about other grammatical morphemes? What about inflectional morphemes? Would we see similar types of phenomena here? And one of the motivations for looking at this is that, again, in the language impaired literature, there were suggestions that especially verbal inflectional morphemes are very, very difficult for children. And people have proposed that this is due to impoverished syntactic representations. However, there were interesting results from a lab in the UK where they found that even for these children, producing the past tense was variable, and it seemed to be conditioned on how complex the final cluster, final coda of the word was. So in this case, children were pretty good with sewed, where the final morpheme is just one consonant. But when it was two consonants, they were worse, and they were really bad when it became even more complex. So this suggested to us that we could look at typically developing children to try and understand some of the variability that we found in their speech as well. So here we went again to the provenance corpus, and I'll just see if this plays here. So this is just a little snip from one of the children, and you can see the gloss there. So
the dog eats the ball, that's right.
Okay, so here we have this nice, compliant, very good mother that Laurie talked about that gave a recast to encourage the child to produce the grammatical morpheme, and he persists in leaving it out again, okay? So despite good modeling in this case, ample opportunity, the morpheme is not there. All right. So what we did was to look at the simple contexts where we predicted, so a form like C's, we predicted that the morpheme would be better produced, and that in the more complex case, it would be omitted. And about 50% of children's verbs were actually of this complex case. So if they proved more challenging, this might account for some of the variability that we found. So again, we went to the provenance corpus and took a look here that children are somewhat older, and their mean length of utterance goes up to about 4 words per utterance. There's less data here because it's a much lower frequency entity than articles are. And here, we see that for 4 of the children, we got quite an effect here. For the last child, he had much less data. So perhaps that's why that was not a significant result. But again, we find patterns that look very similar to what we found with the article cases as well. So this suggests that even the production of certain types of inflectional morphemes are also susceptible to phonological context, and that in this case, we actually found sentence length effects as well. So they were worse when the utterance was longer, suggesting that working memory was also playing a role here. They were also better in final position, utterance final position, compared to utterance medial position. We think that, again, we hadn't anticipated this, but we think that what's going on there is that in a language like English, there's phrase final lengthening. And so there's longer time to actually include articulating all of the consonants in those positions. Whereas utterance medially, these morphemes are actually quite a bit shorter, and there's not as much time to produce there. So we wanted to examine this in an elicited production task where we controlled for these factors and paired it with a audio stimulus so that children heard something like this.
He runs fast.
And then we're asked to produce it. And indeed here in the, we found effects for both the simple versus complex case, but also for the position in the utterance. So in the complex case, in the medial position, children were about 50%, whereas in the simple case, in utterance final position, they're about 80%, which is actually quite similar to what Gherkin found for her article results. So it looks like all of the position and the complexity are again playing a role, suggesting that phonological context is critical here. But we wondered about perception then. So we actually, given that these things are shorter in medial position, we thought we would run in sort of an infant speech perception test to see if indeed, if we had the morpheme present or absent, if the children would notice the difference when we had it finally in an utterance or medially. So we had a grammaticality judgment task here, again controlling for context, and here the children heard these stimuli.
There he cries.
Or let's try this one.
There he cried.
Okay, hopefully there you were waiting for the S that never appeared. Okay, that's good, confident speakers. All right, so the question here is, those were in final position. What would happen in medial position? Would the infants be aware of what's going on in the final position? We thought they probably would. Would they in the medial position? And the answer is no. So for the younger group, these are looking times. There was no effect in the medial position. They showed an effect in the final position, preferring to listen to the grammatical ones longer. And in the older group, again, we saw no effect in the medial position, but in the final position, now the children were doing what you did. They were listening longer, probably to the one where the morpheme was missing, anticipating that it should be there. So this suggests that, again, there may be some perceptual issues going on here, but in production, it's probably not all just perception. So in conclusion, children's first grammatical morphemes tend to occur in these easy types of contexts, depending on the morpheme, but also depending on the structure of the language. And so we can begin to make predictions about which context should be easy and hard. And really, as basic researchers, we need to take this into account. And this hasn't always been true in the field. But also, I think as clinicians in doing assessments of children's actual speech, having some idea of where they're using these morphemes and where they're not could be very informative for designing better intervention. So one can use very simple or more complex types of elicited production tasks to be able to tap into some of these issues. And we're taking this a little bit further now, looking at online sentence processing, testing, using both eye tracking types of methods and EEG, some of which was presented the other day, to try and explore these issues. So we're looking forward to working with the interdisciplinary group that's now here in the Hearing Hub, including with clinicians, to try and tease these issues apart a little bit more and hopefully inform more effective intervention. Thank you.